So given enough information about what health economic modeling is, who are the intended audiences, and what the needs and purposes are, I wanted to go over some of the myths that we currently see in the industry. So one of the myths is, I don't need necessarily a health economic model. I can do a back of the envelope calculation and showcase that. And I think that that's one of the primary myths that we come across. It's not necessarily about building any type of a cost calculator, rather a cost calculation or an economic model that reflects the real world scenario. So we want to incorporate the clinical outcomes, like I mentioned earlier, the quality adjusted life outcomes potentially for patients who, or for indications that may require them. So economic models are important tools for demonstrating not just the cost offsets, but they're important for decision making in health technology to both payers, purchasers, as well as providers and caregivers alike. Another point to talk about in this myth is that technologies with a cost effectiveness and cost utility ratio below the established thresholds typically have a much higher adoption and reimbursement rate. So when we talk about, for example, cost effectiveness analysis in the US, a generally accepted cost effectiveness threshold is, say, $100,000 per QALY. So if a technology can demonstrate that the value add is less than 100,000 or is a dominant strategy over the current market landscape, then the adoption rate is much more favorable. And I've seen this in real life examples where in digital medicine specifically, where it's typically very hard to showcase value, but with a simple cost effectiveness model, it had a much favorable adoption and reimbursement rate. Next, please. Another myth is that budget impact models, as I discussed earlier, are enough to get reimbursement, which may be true in certain scenarios, again, depending on if the new medical device is comparable or new product is comparable to something that's previously existing. However, that's not the case in every single medical device. BIM alone can get you the adoption coverage if you can show the similarity. And a good example I would share is those of the biosimilars. Biosimilars are something that the molecule is somewhat similar to the originator product. So a budget impact model works because there's no difference in clinical efficacy. It's exactly the same. No clinical trials are done. So a budget impact model works well. However, if you have a new technology and if you want to differentiate with the current landscape, there is a need to develop some type of a cost benefit, cost effectiveness, or cost utility model to not just get the reimbursement, but also the adoption and the market share that you want at the end. Next slide. Another myth that I talked about or hinted at earlier is that when it comes to health econ, big and complicated is better, which is not necessarily true since Markov models are still widely used for some reason. And something that I mentioned earlier is the type and the choice of model that you build and choose is highly dependent on the audience that you have. So if you are trying to get reimbursement in for example, in the UK or ex-US reimbursements, they generally rely on Markov models more than microsimulation models. So in that case, a simpler model is much better than what could be a very complicated model. Granted, in cases where the patients or patient populations are extremely heterogeneous, you may need to build a model that's reflective of the patient population. But for most cases, a simple model, Markov model or decision analytic model fits the needs of the payers and providers well. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned earlier, with budget impact model as the only model, another myth is that every stakeholder will want to see the same type of analysis that's done in the past. So if you may have more than one indication that you're trying to target with a single model, it's generally not advisable to repurpose an old model, partly because the indication itself varies. And I can tell you from past experience that people often try to use the same model for, let's say, schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, and potentially maybe for major depressive disorder, because ultimately they have similar outcomes. They look very similar. The clinical pathophysiology looks similar. However, there are key differences between each model that can make or break the reimbursement scenario and coverage for each type of indication. And even across devices. Needless to say that each device may work differently for the same indication. In case of pharma, we see that MOA, or the mechanism of action, may be different for each product that they have. So ultimately, there is a need, even if it's just a modification, slight modification, or validation of those models. Those are previously built. Those models should be revalidated or rebuilt to the spec that is required for reimbursement. Next slide, please. And one of the myths that I do come across often in this industry is that AG models are extremely expensive. They are not the worth the time or the effort to put in. When thinking about the overall reimbursement scenario, what typically companies are thinking of are the extensive trials, extensive work that goes on into building the AG model prior to even starting the AG model. And that's part of the strategy or evidence gathering. That's not necessarily reflective of the health economic models. Health economic models are generally much cheaper than conducting, let's say, an RCT or conducting a network meta-analysis with several studies. And there are several options to conducting a health econ model. As I mentioned earlier, you can take a simpler approach to cut down on those costs and find different efficiencies where the modeling activities could be combined. For example, in the budget impact model, may be combined with the cost effectiveness model to get two outcomes or multiple outcomes from a single model. You don't need to necessarily go to several and look into several studies that have been published to get that evidence. If there's enough support and an indication is widely known, it may be sufficient to justify with a handful of studies on what the patient flow would look like in the model. And it's not, at the end of the day, it's not the all or none event. Even if it's a simple cost minimization model that you can justify with some sort of a Markovian design, and you can justify the estimates that have been taken into account, there is still more value in building a health economic model than not having one. And as I mentioned earlier, there are opportunities to collect data from key opinion leaders that may have already been involved in the in persuasion of the medical device that you have. There are other opportunities that you can leverage data from. So you can, if you don't have enough budgets to get data from real world evidence, maybe looking in the literature is a good starting point to cut down on the budgets. But I would strongly suggest that building a health economic model is quintessential for a successful reimbursement and market penetration. Next slide, please. And lastly, I'll leave you with this thought about health econ, that health economic ends with market access. And that is not true at all, partly because health econ is a starting point for market access. However, most, even if you're talking about AMCP or talking about FDA, they do require persistent data collection as the product launches or post-product launch to collect those data and evolve the models as you go through. So analyses that have been performed at the beginning or pre-launch should be relooked at and revised every few years or so in light of the new data that are collected. And typical examples include if there are any adverse events that are noted, those need to be incorporated into the model. If the effectiveness, oftentimes effectiveness of the product might be completely different from what was observed in a clinical trial, so those models need to be updated with the new effectiveness outcomes. In a 2-year or 3-year time span, maybe there are new products that are competitors to your product to, again, make sure that you stay or stand your position in the market segment. You need to update your models to showcase that your original model was still validated or is still validated and can stand up to the market competition. Next slide, please. One of the last myths here is that investigator-initiated studies at high-profile sites will always provide the best data for health econ models. And that's not true, depending, again, on the audiences that you're looking at. So if you're talking to a clinician, they would regard RCTs as, and RCTs with large sample sizes as the best evidence. And that may not necessarily be true given the type of economic model that you're trying to build and the type of population that you're trying to target. So even if you have a large clinical trial, let's say with 1,000 patients, those are not reflective of the real world population. They may get as close to a real world population, but they are still only targeted to the population that the patients were derived from. Perhaps the patients were all high-risk patients for a certain indication, or maybe they were moderate to severe patients for a given indication. If the given medical device is targeted at generally all patients, then it may be helpful to, for example, do an indirect treatment comparison network meta-analysis from other studies that are published in the literature, which may not even need a clinical trial in the first place. So there are other options that you can leverage to look at the data for your health economic model. And large health systems, databases, academic institutions generally, and I would say university hospitals in specific, could be your key partners in getting those KOLs on board, as well as getting the data that you need to build the HE model. And it is important before launch of your product and in the very early stages to have that coordination with those institutions, to have those discussions very early on to what those risks might be, what the data you can derive from those KOLs and from the university institutions, perhaps, so you can create or start thinking about the model ahead of time.